Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another EAV tutorial. This is a continuation from the previous video, so I highly recommend watching the previous video if you haven't done so already. As you probably guessed from the title, today's tutorial is about automation in your project and how to achieve automation using keyframes. I'm also going to be briefly touching on how to layer items in your project and how to save projects as a template rather than a project file and why this can be useful. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about parameters. So what do I mean by a parameter? Well, there's a number of things in your project that you can change. So for example, if I go into the camera effects, there's a variety of things I can change. For example, the light brightness, the amount of flickering, the amount of camera shaking, the amount of vignette, the amount of film grain. These are all things called parameters because a parameter is something that can just be changed. Now, normally when you change these in a project, they remain the same throughout the whole project. But say, for example, I wanted the camera to start suddenly shaking more during the drop of a song, and I wanted it to stop shaking when the drop finished. You would need to be able to specify new values when the drop started and when the drop ended, and they would need to stay the same during the whole project. That's done with a concept called keyframing. So the way this works is this timeline basically shows the whole project, but it only shows a particular parameter's keyframes at one point. So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select camera shaking, and now if I go into the timeline, I can add a new keyframe for the camera shaking in our project by clicking this plus icon in the top left corner. So by going and clicking that, I've now added a keyframe which appears as a green line if it is selected. If I move behind it, it becomes a red line which shows that it is not currently selected. So to pause the project, I'm going to click the pause button down here. And to select it, I'm going to click on the keyframe, and now the keyframe is selected. So what this means is I can now change the camera shaking by moving this parameter here. And what this will do is when we reach this point in the project, the camera shaking's value will start to increase. In fact, it will suddenly increase to this value, and it will stay like that for the rest of the project unless another keyframe is specified. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to this keyframe. So it's selected when it is green. So when it is green, I can change it. I'm going to change it so it's just a little bit less. And now you notice that when I come off of the camera shaking, even if I deselect it, the parameter is now red, which means that we can't change it because it's been locked in by a particular keyframe. You'll also notice that because I've deselected the camera shaking option and I click on these other parameters, there's nothing in the timeline. That's because you can only see the keyframes for the current parameter that you've selected. So if I click on camera shaking again, you can see that that keyframe appears. So now if I click on this keyframe, you can see that we can now change this value when the keyframe is selected, and it will stay that way throughout the duration of the project unless we add another keyframe. So what I'm going to do is, you can see the camera is now shaking quite a lot. I can probably change it a little bit because we're still changing this keyframe. And now the drop of this song is going to end. So I'm going to pause it. We're now in this particular moment in our project. I'm going to add a new keyframe by clicking the plus icon in the top. If you want to delete a keyframe, you can click the minus icon and the currently selected keyframe will disappear. But I'm going to add a new one by clicking the plus icon in the top. So now you can see if I hover over this one is now selected and this one is not because it's red. We're still obviously using the camera shaking parameter because this has been selected in green. So I'm now going to turn this down so it is completely at 0. So now what will happen is in the project, the value of this keyframe will be active until we reach this one, and then it will suddenly become nothing. So let's play the project. You can see the camera shaking, and now all of a sudden it goes back to that new value. You can add as many keyframes as you want to do this. So I'll just demonstrate that again. So if I play the project from here, you can see this value drops down immediately down to 0. Now, I know what you're thinking. A value that drops down immediately to 0 like that might be a bit abrasive. And just to demonstrate this, I'm going to increase the camera shaking a little bit more. So what happens is when the project gets to this point, the camera's shaking a lot, okay? And then suddenly it stops shaking. Now that could be a problem. If it were to just suddenly stop shaking, it might look a little bit strange. So what we can do is we can actually tell the project that we want it to slowly stop shaking, so slowly transition from here to here. So in order to do that, we have to select the previous keyframe. So we're going to select this keyframe, which is now green, and to control how this value changes from this one to this one, we have to use this box down here, which currently looks like a flat line. Now a flat line basically means a constant change. It's going to, or an immediate change. It's going to suddenly change from that value to that value, which can be a bit janky at times. So we're going to click this, and now it's going to become a diagonal line, which means a linear change. So it's going to, as you can see, it's going to gradually change as the project progresses from that value all the way to that value. Unfortunately, that's not what we want. We want it to stay at this value until we get to about here. Then we want it to linearly transition to here. So in order to do that, I'm going to change this back to a constant value so that it stays the same. We're going to add a new keyframe about here. So we're going to click this plus button again. And now we can say that when this keyframe is selected, we want it to transition linearly. And what this will do is, hopefully, if I play this now, you can see that this value down here, this parameter, is going to transition smoothly down to what we've set it in the new keyframe, which is exactly what it's done. So just to reiterate this, I'm going to, you can't move keyframes, unfortunately. You have to delete them and then regenerate them with a new value. I'm going to add a new keyframe here. So with this new keyframe, what you can see is I've done the exact same thing. So if I go to this keyframe and I let the project transition, you can see it just sort of glides down to the new value, which is nice, a very smooth transition. You don't have to use a linear transition. You can also use a more curved or quadratic transition, which will appear like this, so it will sort of swing downwards. You can also use a sort of a curved but more bouncy transition. So let's take a look. So you can see it sort of goes up very briefly, but then sort of swings back down. You can also use a much more extreme version of this. You can see that moves a lot faster. And then we've got a sort of jittery effect, which is kind of similar, but is more experimental, I think. Just to reiterate this point, I've extended the length of the keyframe just so you can see this a bit more clearly. So it's an interesting transition, but it's not one I would probably use. As I mentioned before, if you click on another parameter, for example, vignette intensity, you can see that the keyframes seem to disappear, but obviously you can only see them for the parameter that you have selected. So if I want to change the parameters for camera shaking, you have to have camera shaking selected by this green box. So if I click on vignette intensity, we can now only see the keyframes for vignette intensity, which there are none, so obviously there's nothing here. You can also automate whether the effects are even visible in the first place by clicking on the camera effects box over here, and I'm going to demonstrate this now. To select the camera effects, you need to click on this box over here, and now the camera effects will be highlighted in white, which shows that you have selected it, and now we can add keyframes to this. So if I wanted this to completely disappear for a portion in the project and then reappear later on, what I can do is, with it selected, I can click the plus button to add a new keyframe. And with the keyframe selected, I don't actually have to do anything because there are no parameters to automate, since it's essentially just automating an on-off switch. So now, if I play this project, you can see it remains off. At the beginning of the project, we need to specify that it is on. So what we need to do is we need to come to the keyframe that exists at the beginning of every single parameter, which is here. So if we come to this keyframe at the very beginning of the project, we can turn this on. Now you'll see that the camera effects text is now in red, which indicates we can't change it because it has been keyframed somewhere. So in order to change it, we have to find that particular keyframe in the project, which happens to be this one, and then either disable it or change it a little bit. So now, if we play the project, you can see that when we reach this keyframe, the camera effects now completely turn off. I can then create a new keyframe somewhere else in the project, for example here, and then I can turn it back on again. So now if I come to this point in the project and I press play, you can see that it starts playing again. There are an extremely large variety of parameters that you can automate in the project, including the light brightness, the flickering, the color, the shaking, the intensity, the film grain intensity, the chromatic aberration, the saturation shift, and yeah, it's all about just experimenting essentially. Don't forget, if you want to remove the timeline, you can click the top right icon up here and the timeline will disappear so you can see the whole project. And then to bring it back, you can just click it again. The next thing I'm going to talk about in this video is layers. As you can see, there are several layers in this project, including a video layer and a visuals layer. But there is also another graphic in this layer. Unfortunately, it's behind the video, so you can't actually see it. And just to demonstrate this, the video layer is graphic 2. And if I click this arrow icon in the top right corner here, you can see that the video is at layer 0. Now my new graphic that you can't see, which is behind the video, if I click this arrow, you can see that it's there, which is sort of shown by the box that's highlighting it, but you can see that it's also at layer 0, which kind of conflicts a little bit. So the way this works is, if we want the new graphic to be in front of the video file, we need to change this to a larger number than the video layer. Because the video is at layer 0, all we need to do is change our graphic layer to be a number larger than 0. So in this case, I'm going to choose 1. And you can see that the graphic now appears. It's just a random shape essentially. I can further reiterate this by dragging this in front of the visuals. So you can see that the visuals are in front of this graphic, which means the visuals must have a larger layer. And they do. The visuals have a layer of 5. The maximum number of layers you can have is 255. If I try and type in a large number, it automatically gets set to 255. However, if I go ahead and change this to a smaller number, say for example I change the visuals to layer 1, like that, and I change the graphic to have a layer of 0, that's going to disappear behind the video, which is not what we want. Instead, if I change the graphics to have a layer of, say for example 5, but then I change the visual to have a layer of 4, you can see that the visuals are obviously in front of the video because the number is larger than the video's number, but it is behind this shape because the shape's number is larger than the visuals. And that's essentially how to layer items in your project. Don't forget, if you want to delete a particular graphic, you have to select the graphic on the left, then click the bin icon, and then the graphic will disappear. Something I didn't mention in much detail in the previous video is the fact that you can change the visualization to be not just frequencies, but you can also change the visualizer to use waves instead. So by going to the analysis box in your visualizer and changing the frequencies to waves, instead the visualizer will use a wave pattern instead. What we can do now that we've got waves, we can change the height of these waves, we can change the number of segments, which will make it look a lot more like waves. We can make it so that there's more samples. What I would recommend doing is, if you're going to use waves, I would recommend changing it to a line type with a moderate thickness, then experimenting with the various parameters such as height and segments and samples. So now we've got a multicolored wave. It could probably use some more segments. And you can also change the frequencies that the waves are looking at. So for example, these waves are sort of replicating the sub bass in the track that you're hearing. If you want to, you can also change the size if you need it to be a little bit smaller by sort of compressing it a little bit. And then maybe you could have this in like a lower corner, for example, down here. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to have this at a full length. And that's essentially how you use waves in your video instead of frequencies if you wish. Another feature that I didn't cover very thoroughly on the previous video is using playlists instead of a single audio file, which is essentially just using multiple audio files. So to do that, we come into the audio tab, we change audio file to playlist, and now the music is going to stop because there's no audio files. We're going to click to add file, and now we get the option to choose some audio files. So I'm going to click an audio file here, just a single audio file. I'm going to load that into the project. So now we just have one audio file, but this time we can click again the button that says click to add file, and we can add another audio file as well. And it's going to keep the first file. You can see the first file is still playing, but now when the first one ends, the second one is going to start playing instead. And I can do the same thing with as many projects as I want. So I can click on another one, and you can see the first two are still as they were, but now the third one is in there at the end as well. So now we essentially have a playlist. There's another way of doing this as well. Let's click to add some more tracks, and I can scroll down, and I can actually select multiple tracks at the same time by holding Control and clicking some tracks. If I click this track, and then I hold Control, I can click another track, and then I can click another track and click Open, and these files will all be loaded in at the same time. So now they'll basically be stitched onto the end. So those last 3 tracks will now be on the end as well. And we now have several tracks in our project. If you made a mistake and you want to remove these audio tracks, you just need to go into the audio tab and select the bin icon, and it will say the current project's audio files will be deleted. Click OK, and then the audio files will disappear. One other thing you can also do is you can change this to system output, which will basically just play whatever's currently playing through your system. So for example, if you're watching a YouTube video, you'll see this line moving, and if you tick this box that says use microphone, you can see that now as I'm talking, the line is changing, which basically corresponds with what I'm saying. Lastly, don't forget to save your work by going into save and then clicking the save icon. If you haven't created a save file, you can go into save as, but you don't have to save it as a project file. Down here, we can save it as either a project or a template. Now, what's the difference between a project file and a template file? The project file essentially contains everything about your project, including the audio and all of the visuals and everything like that. But the template file basically stores the instructions for the file. So essentially it's a way of sharing projects with other people that want to use a similar template. So it will keep things like the visualizer, for example. It will keep automation settings, it will keep the settings of certain parameters, but it will not keep visuals or audio. That's something that you have to add. It's very similar to an Adobe After Effects project that you might want to share with somebody if you want them to use the same visualization, but you want them to use their own audio. It's basically the same thing as that. It's a great way of being able to share visuals with people without giving them your files if you don't wish to do that. And that's essentially it. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. If you have, please make sure you give a like on the video. If there's anything I missed, please ensure you leave a comment asking me some questions, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!